Sumerian Otaku here. What do winged demons, a couple of weird old men, and some facial tumors have in common? Well, apart from being a clown away from the worst nightmare ever, they are all vivid elements of the anime Kobu Tori. Kobu Tori is a 1929 anime created by the winning team of director Chuzo Aochi and animator Yasuji Murata. So what is the story? Well, Kobu Tori begins by following the lives of two old men. One of them, whose name is Tarobe, is hardworking and kind, if a bit on the derpy side of things. The other, named Jirobe, is lazy and greedy. The anime opens with a nice half-iris of Tarobe working his geriatric tush off and wiping the sweat from his wrinkled brow. Note how his elaborate character design contrasts with the sparse nature of the background. Next we see the lazy old man Jirobe, with a look on his face like he just smelled a fart as he fondles a rather sizable facial tumor in disdain. Tarobe works hard every day, so we're told, and to show how hard-working he is, we're treated to some sweet parallax scrolling as we watch the camera pan to Tarobe. What is parallax scrolling? Well, that's when the elements further back in the composition move the slowest, while the elements closer to the foreground move progressively faster. That's the kind of scrolling that video games use, especially in the 16-bit era. Parallax scrolling is used rather sparsely in Kobu Tori, but when it is used, it's used to great effect. Next, Tarobe wears himself out chopping down a tree and notices the approaching rainstorm. Look how carefully his actions are depicted and how many frames are devoted to his basic movements. This is a level of detail often missing from the stylistic simplicity of modern anime. I mean, just look at how smooth the animation is when Tarobe gets off of that log. As the storm comes, the scene of the clouds moving behind the trees is quite striking, the first of several beautiful depictions of the storm. Who knew that you could achieve such an emotional style with monochromatic line drawings? The way that Murata, the animator, builds up this storm is magnificent. He has a great feel for montage and cuts masterfully between the various images of storm and Tarobe cowering in the cave. Indeed, this anime is brimming over with great editing, and if you can draw yourself out of the story long enough to notice, take note of all the scene changes that happen. They're always done with a sense of purpose and really help to tell the story. Tarobe is frightened of the storm, and he looks for a place to hide. And to me, this is one of the most beautiful scenes in Kobu Tori. And it's basically where Tarobe is sitting in the tree watching the storm. There's just such a nice balance to the way that Murata set up all of the elements. You have Tarobe mostly silhouetted in the foreground, reacting to the frightening weather. His body provides a large area of darkness on the right, which is perfectly balanced and contrasted with the bright vista of the intensely animated storm. The inner tree trunk is stationary, providing stability to the two types of movement, the slow and smooth movement of Tarobe on the right, and the quick and jagged movement of the rain outside of the tree. Here we also get a humorous depiction of bats gathering. Murata gives them cartoon anthropomorphism and shows their mouths moving as they discuss why the hell there's a crazy man stowed away in their tree trunk. When the storm clears up, and Tarobe is finally allowed to leave his tree, we're treated to a visual of the clouds fading, and the well-animated silhouettes of birds flying across the screen. Finally, the light fades into clear night and what might be the Cancer constellation. I say Cancer constellation, but it doesn't quite look like the Cancer constellation. I honestly don't know what it is, so if anyone in the comments happens to know, or happens to know what it might have to do with this story, then yeah, go ahead and leave a comment about it. I'd love to know. In any case, it was a rather striking depiction of the storm letting up, and such artistic touches were rare in Japanese animation at that time. Truth be told, such touches were rare in Disney animation of that time. This was, after all, long before Disney's game changer, Snow White, appeared on the screen in 1938. As Tarube awakens, he is silhouetted entirely. You can't see any details of him, he is just completely enshrouded in darkness. Tarube puts his hand to his ear, and at this point, Murata does an excellent crossfade from Tarube listening to the strange instruments to the strange instruments playing that he's listening to. First, we get a close-up of some drumming, and then it fades into a flautist, and then a smaller drummer, and finally back to Tarube, as he gets up and moves from the dark into the light. It's almost as if Tarube is being born into this new world. He was curled up in the tree trunk earlier, in the darkness, and then he creeps out, and slowly the world around him unfolds. And what a wonderful world it is. As I said before, the editing in Kobu Tori is excellent. As Tarube quietly creeps up to the commotion, we get an iris out of a strange and ornately dressed man with a large nose and a fan. This is a Tengu. A Tengu is a form of kami, or godlike being, which has been present in Japanese mythology since at least the 7th century BC. Tengu literally means heavenly dog, and may have originally signified a dog-like demon. In its first recorded usage, the word Tengu was used to describe a meteor that presumably had an association with dogs. However, early on, the term came to depict a sort of bird man. There are several different ways that Tengu have traditionally been depicted, ranging from mostly man to mostly bird. When a Tengu is depicted as mostly man, as it is here, the main thing marking the man as a Tengu is the large nose. This long-snouted, mostly man Tengu is the chief of all the other Tengu around him. Those other Tengu who serve him are depicted as more bird-like. This builds up an interesting dichotomy in Kobu Tori between man and beast. Indeed, a strange hierarchy is set up in which the more human-like Tengu rules over the more beast-like Tengu. Although there are definitely hierarchies in the animal kingdom, if you think about it, a king is generally a concept of human civilization, and so it makes sense that the more human you are, the more likely you'd be to adopt these characteristics. This chief Tengu carries a Ha-Uchiwa, or feather fan, which has many magical abilities, including the ability to control the wind. Although they don't have a magical fan, the lower level Tengu are magical too in this anime, and they have the ability to disappear and reappear at will. They mostly use this ability to serve the chief Tengu. As Tarube walks up and sees the Tengu festively dancing, he begins to emulate them and dances up a storm. All of the Tengu suddenly notice him, and the chief Tengu then asks to see his dance. The Tengu are delighted to see Tarube as he dances for them in a well-cut montage that switches between his dance and the various instruments playing. The Tengu chief loves Tarube's goofy dance, and even gives a chastising look to one of his subjects, who begins laughing at the old man. Afterward, Tarube bows in reverence to the chief, who offers the old man a drink and asks him to come back the following night to receive a gift. Since the chief really wants to see the old man again, he asks his right-hand man to take something valuable from Tarube to ensure that he'll come back. He decides that since the Tengu value their beaks very much, Tarube would similarly value his facial tumor, since it is a big protuberance on his face, much like the beaks. The Tengu decide to violently extract this tumor in a darkly humorous scene that borders on body horror. A Tengu chases Tarabe down and begins yanking the tumor off of the horrified old man's face. One Tengu, however, isn't strong enough, so he calls in reinforcements who form a sort of tug-of-war conga line and eventually yank the tumor off of his face. Note the action lines drawn into the animation of the shot where the sharp fingers are ripping the tumor. After a considerable amount of pulling, they actually yank the tumor off, and it goes flying toward the chief, who catches it on his magical fan. Tarabe is initially horrified, but he's delighted to find that he no longer has the tumor. The next morning, Tarabe tells his friend, the greedy Jirobe, about what happened the night before. Here, Murata does a great job animating Tarabe as he emulates the Tengu beaks with his hands and tugs on his face and raises his hands in resistance as he tells Jirobe his story. Jirobe, as we know from the intertitles, is very greedy, and he wants that gift that the Tengu promised to Tarabe the night before. He believes that his clumsy stick dance will amuse them just as much as Jirobe's spontaneous dance did. As night falls, we're treated to an overconfident Jirobe dancing his way to the Tengu in the spotlight of the moon. It is very, very fun animation. Jirobe bows to the chief, and the camera crabs left to show the laughing king of the Tengu, fully expecting another wonderful performance. He accidentally smacks one of them on the head as he obliviously continues his dance. Then he hurls his stick at the chief, who barely manages to deflect it with his fan, and then he tries to steal the treasure. Because of this, 3 angry Tengu attack Jirobe, yank his hood down, and one of them humorously even pecks him on the head. The Tengu threaten Jirobe with death, and he begs for his life. The chief agrees to let him live, but contemptuously hurtles Tarabe's tumor onto Jirobe's face, telling him to take it and leave. Jirobe recoils in agony as he realizes that he now has 2 heavy tumors on the side of his face, giving his head a somewhat testicular look. The chief then uses his magical fan to blow Jirobe away over the trees in a comical use of limited animation. Limited animation is a style of animation that uses very few actual frames of animation, and will oftentimes just manipulate the image rather than creating different frames to show its movement. Limited animation is present when you have characters that stand completely still, but have moving lips, as is often the case of modern animation, or in this case, characters who aren't animated frame by frame, but instead are just moved and rotated across the screen. The effect of limited animation can be quite hilarious when used with moderation and purpose, as Murata does here. After Jirobe goes spinning over the treetops, he gets his britches caught in a tree and is left to dangle while a pair of crows chide him and call him an idiot. This humorous sequence makes a wonderful ending to Kobu Tori, and it's punctuated by the fact that the animals speak at the end. Kobu Tori's animator and co-director, Yasuji Murata, was quite talented, as the animation in Kobu Tori reveals again and again. He's closely followed the career and techniques of Yamato Sanai, and he became one of the foremost animators working with cutout animation. Over the course of his career, Murata created over 30 animations for Yokohama Cinema. Most of these animations, including Kobu Tori, were educational animations, at least on paper. After all, what really is educational about demons cursing a man with another man's tumor? Well, I guess you could say that if you're greedy, envious, and a bad dancer, you're likely to have a tumor magically sewn into your face. Not much of a lesson, really, but in 1929, as long as the anime contained the slightest kernel of educational value, it'd be allowed into theaters. Japanese animation in 1929 had considerable competition from abroad and had to be quite impressive to compete with the likes of Disney's Steamboat Willie, which had synced sound, and Paramount's Felix the Cat, whose bizarre antics had wowed audiences since 1919. Like most Japanese animators of the time, Murata was a lone animator working on Kobu Tori all by himself. He simply couldn't compete with all of the gags packed into a typical Felix cartoon, or the fast-paced continuous movement in Steamboat Willie. Murata instead focused on making the story come together in a very cohesive way, with interesting characters and wonderful editing throughout. Thanks for watching this episode of Sumerian Otaku. Anime now and forever, Otaku out!